The morning air hung thick with humidity over the Philippine waters east of Samar Island. October 25th, 1944. The date would burn itself into naval history within hours. Ensign William Brooks gripped his binoculars with trembling hands. His Grumman TBF Avenger flew steady at 1,500 feet above gray waters that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The routine anti-submarine patrol had launched from escort carrier USS St. Lo at dawn. Nothing about this morning felt routine anymore. The words forming in his throat would chill every man in Task Unit 77.4.3. His radio crackled to life with a transmission that defied belief. Those ships below were not American vessels. From his aerial perch, Brooks stared down at something impossible, something that shattered every assumption about Japanese fleet positions. The enemy was supposed to be hundreds of miles away. Intelligence reports had placed them far to the west. Yet there they were, steaming at full speed directly toward 6 small escort carriers. Pagoda masts pierced the morning haze like ancient towers. The distinctive silhouette of the world's largest battleship cut through patches of mist. An entire armada of heavy cruisers and battleships powered forward with deadly purpose. Their target lay defenseless ahead. 6 escort carriers possessed nothing capable of stopping this approaching nightmare. Their thin hulls would crumple like paper under the massive guns now bearing down on them. The mathematics of destruction were simple and terrifying. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague commanded Task Unit 77.4.3 from his flagship. Every report had assured him that Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet protected his northern approaches. The San Bernardino Strait between Luzon and Samar should have been blocked by American battleships. Should have been. Instead, materializing from the early morning darkness at 06:37 hours, came the full might of the Imperial Japanese Navy's center force. 4 massive battleships, including the legendary Yamato. 6 heavy cruisers bristling with 8-inch guns. 2 light cruisers adding their rapid-fire batteries. 11 destroyers completing the formation. The opposing forces created an equation that belonged in nightmares. Japanese center force versus 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, no battleships, no heavy cruisers, no fleet carriers. Naval warfare calculations were about to be rewritten, not in textbooks or planning rooms, but in decisions that would be made in the next 60 seconds. The impossible confrontation was about to trigger one of the most audacious actions in maritime history. Tiny destroyers would charge battleships. Suicide runs that logic said could never succeed. The path to this moment had been carved over months of relentless American advance across the Pacific. By October 1944, Philippine liberation had become strategically inevitable. American forces had stormed ashore at Leyte Island on October 20th. The invasion threatened Japan's lifeline to critical resources. Oil fields in the Dutch East Indies. Rubber plantations throughout Southeast Asia. These resources flowing northward kept the Japanese war machine breathing. Without that steady stream of materials, the empire would suffocate within months. Strangulation by strategic strangulation. Imperial Japanese Navy commanders understood this existential crisis. Their response was Operation Shogo Ichi. Victory Operation Number 1. A complex 3-pronged assault designed to annihilate the American invasion fleet anchored in Leyte Gulf. The plan sparkled with tactical brilliance. 3 separate naval forces would converge from different compass points. Precise coordination would be essential. Timing would be everything. Success would require flawless execution across hundreds of miles of ocean. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would lead the northern force southward from Japan. His command consisted of 4 aircraft carriers, but these flat tops were hollow shells of their former strength. Carriers Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda embarked barely 100 aircraft combined. Their pilots were so inexperienced that many struggled with basic carrier landings. Green aviators who had received minimal flight training. Boys pressed into service as Japan's veteran pilots lay dead across the Pacific. The Northern Force existed purely as bait. Sacrificial offerings to lure Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from Leyte Gulf. Ozawa accepted his mission with samurai resignation. His carriers would draw American battleships northward like moths to flame. While Halsey chased shadows, the real killing blow would fall elsewhere. The Northern Force was expendable. Every man aboard understood this harsh reality. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura commanded the Southern Force. His battleships would approach northward through Surigao Strait from the south. Yamashiro and Fuso would provide the heavy punch. Heavy cruiser Mogami would add her 8-inch guns. 4 destroyers would complete the formation. This southern approach would strike the invasion fleet from below. Synchronized with the other forces, it would create devastating crossfire. American ships would be caught between multiple threats. Confusion and panic would multiply the carnage. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita controlled the center force, the most powerful element of the 3-pronged attack. His ships would transit through San Bernardino Strait to strike directly at vulnerable transport vessels in Leyte Gulf. The center force represented the cream of remaining Japanese naval power. 3 years of attrition warfare had decimated the Imperial Navy. What remained was concentrated in Kurita's command. The super battleship Yamato displaced 72,800 tons. Her main battery mounted 9 18-1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever fitted to a warship. Each gun fired a 3,220-pound armor-piercing shell. These projectiles could travel over 26 miles with devastating accuracy. Her sister ship Musashi sailed alongside, an identical floating fortress that had never suffered damage in combat. 2 invincible titans of the seas. Battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna added their heavy guns to the formation. 14-inch and 16-inch rifles that could shatter any American ship smaller than a battleship. 10 heavy cruisers provided crushing mid-range firepower. Atago, Takao, Maya, Chokai, Mayoko, Haguro, Kumano, Suzuya, Tone, and Chikuma. Each cruiser mounted 8 or 10 8-inch guns, weapons designed specifically to destroy unarmored targets. Light cruisers Noshiro and Yahagi screened the formation. Their rapid-fire 6-inch batteries could shred destroyer-sized vessels. 11 destroyers completed the massive force. On paper, Operation Shogo 1 appeared brilliant. Multiple converging attacks would overwhelm American defenses. The plan required perfect timing and flawless communication. Both would prove impossible to achieve. American submarines had already begun unraveling the operation before it fully deployed. On October 23rd, submarines USS Darter and USS Dace patrolled the Palawan Passage west of the Philippines. Their sonar operators detected massive underwater contacts. Kurita's force was transiting toward Leyte. Commander David McClintock commanded Darter. Commander Bladen Claggett led Dace. The 2 submarine skippers coordinated a textbook attack approach. At dawn on October 23rd, they struck with devastating precision. Darter's torpedoes slammed into heavy cruiser Atago, Kurita's flagship. The massive underwater explosions tore the cruiser apart like tissue paper. Atago sank in 18 minutes. 360 men went down with her. Vice Admiral Kurita was forced to abandon his command ship. The Japanese admiral found himself swimming for his life in shark-infested waters. Destroyer Kishinami eventually pulled him from the sea, but the psychological impact of nearly drowning while his flagship exploded around him would haunt Kurita's decision-making. 48 hours later off Samar, those memories would prove crucial. Darter's second torpedo spread, struck heavy cruiser Takao. The explosions blew off her stern section. Seawater flooded her engineering spaces. Though Takao survived, she was crippled beyond immediate repair. 2 destroyers escorted her limping back to Brunei. 3 ships removed from Kurita's force in minutes. Dace torpedoed heavy cruiser Maya with equally devastating results. Maya exploded spectacularly. The cruiser sank within minutes. Her destruction lit the pre-dawn sky with orange flames. In 1 hour, American submarines had sunk 2 heavy cruisers, crippled a third, nearly killed the Japanese commander. Kurita transferred his flag to super battleship Yamato. He pressed eastward despite the catastrophic losses. The plan demanded his arrival at Leyte Gulf at dawn on October 25th. No time existed for reorganization or reconsideration. The schedule was sacred. Deviation meant failure. October 24th brought fresh catastrophe for Kurita's force. American carrier aircraft from Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet located the center force transiting the Sibuyan Sea. Wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked throughout the afternoon. The assault focused on super battleship Musashi. Over 4 hours, Musashi absorbed punishment that would have obliterated any other warship afloat. American pilots claimed 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb impacts. Japanese sources recorded 11 torpedoes and 10 bombs. The exact count remained forever debated. The result was indisputable. At 19:35 hours on October 24th, Musashi capsized and sank. Over 1,000 men died with her. Her sister ship Yamato would face the next morning's battle without her. Kurita's force absorbed such punishment in the Sibuyan Sea that he temporarily reversed course westward around 1500 hours. The movement appeared to be a retreat. American pilots reported the center force as heavily damaged and withdrawing from battle. Admiral Halsey read these reports aboard his flagship USS New Jersey. The intelligence would prove catastrophically wrong. That same evening brought more intelligence to Halsey. Reports of Ozawa's carrier force approaching from the north. The bait dangled before American eyes proved irresistible. Carriers represented the decisive weapon of Pacific naval warfare. The instruments that had won at Coral Sea and Midway. The platforms that had devastated Japanese bases from Rabaul to Truk. A chance to destroy the remnants of Japan's carrier aviation could not be ignored. Halsey took his entire Third Fleet northward at maximum speed. All 6 fast battleships. 8 fleet carriers with their escorts. Everything raced toward Ozawa's sacrificial force. Halsey left no ships to guard San Bernardino Strait. More critically, he failed to communicate this decision clearly to Admiral Thomas Kinkaid. Kinkaid commanded 7th Fleet, responsible for protecting the Leyte invasion. A communication breakdown of epic proportions was unfolding. Halsey had sent a preparatory dispatch about forming Task Force 34, a powerful battleship group under Admiral Willis Lee to guard the strait. But this was merely a contingency plan, not an executed order. Through miscommunications and assumptions, Kinkaid believed Task Force 34 had been detached. Admiral Chester Nimitz in Pearl Harbor read the same dispatches. He made identical assumptions. Everyone believed powerful American battleships guarded San Bernardino Strait. No such force existed. The strait lay completely open and undefended. Kurita reorganized his battered force after Musashi's loss. He reversed course again after nightfall. His ships steamed eastward through the darkness. At 00:35 hours on October 25th, the center force passed through San Bernardino Strait unopposed. Not a single American ship observed the passage. Not one aircraft detected their movement. The center force had been reduced, but remained formidable. 4 battleships led by Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, Chokai, Chikuma, Haguro, Kumano, Suzuya, and Tone, light cruisers, Noshiro and Yahagi, 11 destroyers. Now they headed south along Samar's eastern coast, toward completely undefended American landing beaches. Between Kurita's overwhelming firepower and General Douglas MacArthur's 130,000 vulnerable troops ashore stood only 3 small task units of escort carriers. Radio call signs Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. These were never designed for surface combat. Built on merchant ship hulls at Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver, Washington, they were slow, lightly armed, and unarmored. Their purpose was providing close air support for troops ashore, conducting anti-submarine patrols, hunting enemy submarines with depth charges and sonar. The escort carriers mounted single 5-inch guns for self-defense. Several dozen 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft weapons. Their aircraft carried bombs and rockets meant for Japanese bunkers and supply trucks. Not armor-piercing weapons for naval combat against battleships. The carriers themselves achieved maximum speeds of 18 knots, barely faster than the merchant vessels from which they were converted. Japanese cruisers could sustain 30 knots. They would close range inexorably, regardless of American maneuvering. Mathematics and physics favored the enemy overwhelmingly. Taffy 3 occupied the northernmost position, closest to San Bernardino Strait, commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. The 48-year-old career officer was known as Ziggy. This distinguished him from Rear Admiral Thomas Sprague, no relation, commanding Taffy 1 90 miles south. Ziggy Sprague's force consisted of 6 Casablanca-class escort carriers. Each displaced 7,800 tons, about 50,000 tons combined displacement. USS Fanshawe Bay, hull number CVE-70, served as flagship. USS St. Lo, CVE-63. USS White Plains, CVE-66. USS Kalinin Bay, CVE-68. USS Kitkin Bay, CVE-71. USS Gambier Bay, CVE-73. Each carrier embarked approximately 28 aircraft, divided between FM-2 Wildcat fighters and TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. Wildcats were improved versions of the obsolescent F-4F fighter, adequate for ground support but outclassed by modern Japanese fighters. Total aircraft strength for Taffy 3 numbered approximately 165 planes, equivalent to 2 fleet carriers in numbers, but with pilots trained primarily for ground support missions rather than naval combat. Close air support for infantry. Bombing supply dumps and truck convoys. Anti-submarine warfare against prowling enemy submarines. Screening these carriers were 7 small warships, collectively designated the Small Boys, a term of endearment that reflected both their size and crew's affection for ships designed for unglamorous escort duty. 3 Fletcher-class destroyers provided the heaviest punch. USS Johnston, DD-557, USS Howell, DD-533, USS Hirman, DD-532. Each displaced 2,100 tons fully loaded. They carried 5 single 5-inch guns in enclosed turrets. These weapons fired 54-pound shells to ranges of 18,000 yards under ideal conditions. Effective range against moving targets was considerably less. Their main anti-ship weapons were 10 21-inch torpedo tubes. 2 quintuple mounts carried Mark 15 torpedoes. Each torpedo packed an 825-pound warhead. Range of 10,000 yards at 46 knots. devastating weapons against unarmored targets. 4 John C. Butler-class destroyer escorts completed the screen. USS Samuel By Roberts, DE-4113, USS Dennis, DE-405, USS John C. Butler, DE-339, USS Raymond, DE-341. Each displaced only 1,350 tons. They mounted just 2 5-inch guns without sophisticated fire control systems. They carried 3 torpedo tubes, adequate for anti-submarine work but minimal for surface combat against armored warships. These tiny vessels had been designed primarily for convoy escort duty. Hunting submarines with sonar and depth charges, not engaging battleships whose armor belts were thicker than the destroyer escort's entire hulls. At 06:37 hours on October 25, 1944, Ensign William Brooks spotted the approaching Japanese force. His routine anti-submarine patrol had launched from St. Lo at 06:05 hours, part of the Combat Air Patrol and anti-submarine sweep. Orders were routine. Patrol a sector 20 miles north and west of Taffy Threes. Watch for submarines. Report anything unusual. The pre-dawn sky showed dirty yellow-gray hues typical of tropical mornings. Broken clouds at 1,500 feet. Visibility about 20 miles interrupted by occasional rain squalls. At 06:37 hours, something very unusual appeared on the northern horizon. Brooks descended to investigate. His radio transmission froze blood in every listener's veins. Ships bearing 240 degrees. Estimate 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, 11 destroyers. Rear Admiral Sprague received the initial report with disbelief bordering on irritation. "Some screwy young aviator reporting part of our own forces," he muttered to his staff on Fanshawe Bay's flag bridge. The identification must be mistaken. Those had to be Admiral Lee's battleships from Task Force 34. Everyone knew Task Force 34 was guarding San Bernardino Strait. Sprague ordered Brooks to verify his identification. 3 minutes later, at 06:40 hours, Brooks confirmed his sighting. Words that made Sprague's blood run cold. "I can see pagoda masts. I see the biggest meatball flag on the biggest battleship I ever saw." No mistaking those distinctive pagoda-style superstructures. Those were Japanese battleships. They were heading directly toward Taffy Threes at high speed. Course and speed indicated hostile intent. Range was closing rapidly. At 06:45 hours, lookouts on the escort carriers spotted anti-aircraft bursts on the northwestern horizon. Japanese ships were engaging Brooks' Lone Avenger with their anti-aircraft batteries. Moments later, colored splashes began erupting around the carriers. Japanese ships had opened fire with ranging shots. The Japanese used different colored dyes in their shells. Red, green, yellow, and blue markers allowed spotters to identify which ship was scoring hits. One officer later described it as a deadly rainbow advancing across the water. Brilliant hues created beautiful but terrifying fountains. Shells weighing hundreds of pounds detonated on impact with seawater. At 06:46 hours, Yamato fired her first salvo from maximum range. 9 18.1-inch guns hurled 9 tons of steel and explosive toward the small American carriers. The sound was indescribable. Thunder that seemed to split the sky itself. Shells screamed through the air like freight trains. Sprague faced an impossible tactical situation with no good options available. His carriers could not outrun the Japanese force. Even coaxing 19 knots from engines designed for 18 knots, the carriers would be overtaken within 2 hours maximum. His 5-inch guns could not penetrate battleship or heavy cruiser armor. Destroyer guns could damage cruiser superstructures, but not sink them. His aircraft were armed for ground support missions, general-purpose bombs and rockets for shore bombardment, not armor-piercing bombs or anti-ship torpedoes designed for naval combat. Torpedo bombers carried Mark 13 aerial torpedoes. Most had already expended them on dawn strikes against shore targets. Japanese positions around Leyte Gulf had been the primary focus. The nearest American heavy ships capable of challenging Kurita belonged to Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's bombardment group, 90 miles to the south. Those battleships had just finished annihilating the Japanese southern force in night battle at Surigao Strait. They had depleted most of their armor-piercing ammunition in that engagement. They could not reach Samar for hours, even at maximum speed. Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet was 300 miles to the north, pursuing Ozawa's sacrificial carriers. Even if recalled immediately, Halsey's battleships needed 6 hours to reach Samar. Sprague had perhaps 15 minutes before Japanese shells found their range. Systematic destruction of his carriers would begin shortly thereafter. Yet, in those minutes, he formulated a response that would become a masterclass in naval tactics against overwhelming odds. First, he ordered all carriers to launch every available aircraft immediately. Pilots scrambled to their planes, still wearing pajamas or shorts. Engines turned over before pre-flight checks were complete. Planes roared off carrier decks, armed with whatever ordnance happened to be loaded. Some carried depth charges meant for submarines. Others carried general-purpose bombs for shore bombardment. Some launched with empty wings. Their pilots intended to make dry runs to distract Japanese gunners. Second, Sprague turned his formation east-southeast toward a rain squall his radar operator had spotted 5 miles ahead. Weather would partially mask his ships, by precious minutes for organization and planning. Every second counted now. Third, he ordered maximum speed from his carriers. Engineering crews pushed boilers beyond design limits, coaxing every possible revolution from turbines never intended for sustained combat speeds. Pressure gauges climbed into red zones. Safety regulations were abandoned. Fourth, Sprague commanded his escorts to generate smoke. Destroyers and destroyer escorts carried chemical smoke generators. These could produce thick artificial fog banks. Combined with black funnel smoke from carriers' overheated boilers, the smoke would create dense screens. Japanese optical rangefinders would struggle with visibility. At 0650 hours, Sprague transmitted an uncoded radio message on all frequencies. Under attack by Japanese cruiser force of 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, at position 11 degrees 46 minutes north, 126 degrees 20 minutes east. Request immediate assistance. The clear text broadcast violated normal radio security procedures. Every American naval unit in the Philippines received Sprague's call. Immediate panic erupted in multiple headquarters. Admiral Kincaid, still engaged with remnants of the Southern force, realized with horror that no American heavy ships protected the northern approach. Admiral Halsey, 300 miles north at Cape Engano, engaging Ozawa's carriers, received Sprague's call with equal horror. Relief would take hours to arrive. Taffy Threes had only minutes remaining. At 7:01 hours, the first Japanese salvos began landing among the carriers. Scale of incoming fire defied comprehension for men who had spent the war providing close air support and hunting submarines. Yamato's 18.1-inch guns fired shells weighing 3,220 pounds. Projectiles heavier than compact automobiles. Heavy cruiser 8-inch guns fired 260-pound shells, designed specifically to gut unarmored targets like escort carriers. Battleship Congo's 14-inch guns added their weight to the barrage. Against this onslaught, carriers' thin steel hulls offered no protection whatsoever. Hull plating was fractions of an inch thick in places. Single large-caliber hits could gut escort carriers from stem to stern. Multiple hits would sink one within minutes. The mathematics of destruction were simple and terrifying. Sprague's ships zigzagged frantically, using a tactic called chasing splashes. Officers directing ships' maneuvers watched where shells landed. They immediately steered toward those spots, gambling that Japanese gunners would not fire twice at the same location. This desperate improvisation actually worked more often than not. Japanese gunners trained to lead targets moving in straight lines. They struggled to adjust for American ships constantly changing course toward previous shell impacts. Shells that should have struck home instead screamed past bows or sterns, missing by yards instead of striking center mass. But some shells found their marks. White planes took a direct hit that fortunately failed to explode. The armor-piercing shell passed completely through her thin hull and out the other side. A dud that should have detonated amidships. Kalinin Bay was straddled repeatedly by near misses. Geysers of water cascaded across her flight deck. Shrapnel jammed her rudder temporarily. The rain squall provided temporary reprieve at 07:06 hours. For 10 precious minutes, Taffy Threes steamed through torrential rain that reduced visibility to less than 1,000 yards. Japanese guns fell temporarily silent, unable to see their targets through the deluge. Optical rangefinders were useless in the downpour. Officers and crews used those minutes to organize damage control parties, prepare abandoned ship stations, say prayers. Many men believed they would not survive the next hour, but they remained at their stations, determined to sell their lives dearly. Honor demanded no less. As Taffy 3 emerged from the squall at 07:16 hours, the tactical situation had worsened dramatically. Kurita's force, faster than American carriers, had closed range by several miles during the chase. Colored splashes now erupted all around the carriers with frightening accuracy. Near misses sent shrapnel sleeting across flight decks. Direct hits were inevitable. Mathematics demanded it. Sprague made the decision that would define the battle and save his carriers. At 07:16 hours, he ordered the destroyers to conduct torpedo attacks against the Japanese force. Without waiting for detailed instructions, Commander Ernest Evans of USS Johnston had already charged toward the enemy. At 07:10 hours, 6 minutes before receiving Sprague's order, Evans had independently turned Johnston northward. His attack run was already beginning. Evans was Cherokee and Creek Indian from Oklahoma, proud of his heritage, fearless to the point of recklessness in combat. His features reflected Native American ancestry. This earned him the nickname Chief among his crew, though never to his face. At Johnston's commissioning ceremony on October 27, 1943, exactly 1 year and 2 days before the Battle of Samar, Evans addressed his assembled crew, words that became legendary. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way. Anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Not a single sailor requested transfer. Evans spent the intervening year training Johnston to an edge so sharp his crew could execute complex maneuvers by instinct alone. Gunnery drills were conducted daily. Damage control parties practiced constantly. Every officer and enlisted man cross-trained on multiple stations. Now Evans pointed his ship toward the heart of the Japanese formation. He ordered flank speed. Johnston's turbines screamed as she accelerated past 35 knots, racing toward ships that outweighed her 50-1. Mathematical impossibility made manifest. Range when Johnston began her attack run was approximately 35,000 yards, over 17 nautical miles. Her Mark 15 torpedoes had effective range of 10,000 yards. just under 6 miles. To launch torpedoes, Evans would have to penetrate to point-blank range in naval terms. Closing through 17 miles of heavy gunfire from dozens of enemy weapons, Johnston's crew laid chemical smoke as she charged, generating thick artificial fog that partially obscured her from Japanese optical rangefinders. But smoke could not stop shells. Physics remained unchanged. At 07:07 hours, Johnston engaged Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano with her 5.5-inch guns at maximum range. The Mark 37 Fire Control Director, linked to Mark 1A computer, gave American destroyers devastating advantages in gunnery accuracy. While Japanese optical rangefinders struggled with smoke, rain, and rapidly changing ranges, Johnston's radar painted perfect firing solutions, continuously updated in real time. Johnston's shells began hitting Kumano repeatedly. American destroyers' 54-pound projectiles could not penetrate the cruiser's armored belt. 4 to 5 inches of hardened steel protected her vital areas. But they could devastate superstructure and upper works. Thinner armor and numerous flammable materials created vulnerabilities there. Over 10 minutes, Johnston fired over 200 main battery rounds at Kumano. Astonishing rate of fire maintained through superbly trained gun crews working in perfect coordination. At least 45 shells struck the heavy cruiser, starting multiple fires, devastating her bridge and fire control stations. Kumano's topside became hell of exploding shells and burning metal. Communications were severed. Fire control was disrupted. Though her engines remained functional and main battery intact, Kumano's ability to fight effectively was severely degraded. Confusion replaced coordination. At 07:20 hours, having closed to 10,300 yards, Evans launched Johnston's entire spread of 10 torpedoes. Weapons streaked through water at 46 knots, leaving phosphorescent wakes pointing directly back at their launcher. One torpedo, possibly two, slammed into Kumano's bow. Explosions tore off the entire forward section of the cruiser, from bow to forward turret. Kumano's speed dropped immediately to 8 knots. Water flooded forward compartments through the massive hole where her bow had been. The heavy cruiser was crippled, but not sunk. She would survive, but play no further role in the battle. She spun away from the chaos. Heavy cruiser Susuya moved alongside to shield her damaged companion. 2 powerful Japanese warships vanished from the opening moments when their presence mattered most. Johnston had pulled off something that defied belief. A tiny destroyer weighing barely over 2,000 tons had crippled a massive 13,000-ton heavy cruiser. That enemy ship carried 10 enormous 8-inch guns. Each single weapon outweighed Johnston's complete main armament. Victory extracted its payment immediately. The cost came swift and brutal. At 7:03 that morning, Johnston wheeled to disappear into her own gray smoke clouds. Yamato's massive guns swiveled toward what appeared to be an American light cruiser. Fire control officers had misidentified their target. Johnston's fierce assault and the severe punishment she had delivered to Kumano convinced them she was something much larger. 20,300 yards separated the ships. More than 9 nautical miles of open ocean stretched between them. Yamato's precision optical rangefinders locked onto Johnston with lethal accuracy. 9 enormous shells roared from the battleship's main battery. 3 18.1-inch projectiles struck Johnston within seconds of each other. The first shell punched below the waterline. Johnston's unarmored hull offered no more resistance than tissue paper to a rifle bullet. The massive projectile tore through steel plating as if it didn't exist. Explosion followed penetration. The blast ripped into the after-engine room like a bomb going off in a closet. Steam lines ruptured everywhere. Compartments flooded instantly. Pressurized vapor at 600 degrees erupted in scalding clouds. The superheated steam flashed seawater into more deadly vapor. Men working in the engine spaces died within heartbeats. Some perished from the initial blast. Others were boiled alive by escaping steam that filled every available space. The second shell smashed into Johnston's midsection. Her after-engine disappeared completely. Power to the ship's rear half severed in an instant. Speed plummeted from 35 knots to 17 knots. The destroyer shuddered as her remaining engine struggled alone. The third shell struck 2/3 of the way back along her length. Electrical power to 3 5-inch gun turrets vanished. Only her 2 forward mounts remained operational. Each 18.1-inch shell carried destructive power beyond human comprehension. These projectiles weighed 3,220 pounds apiece. 73 pounds of Type 88 explosive packed each warhead. Japanese engineers designed them to punch through 16 inches of armor plating at 20-mile range. Only then would they detonate inside enemy battleships. Against Johnston's thin, unarmored hull, they passed completely through before exploding. The delayed action fuses triggered detonation after overpenetration. This accident of timing actually saved Johnston from immediate annihilation. Had those shells exploded on impact, the destroyer would have split in half. Even with overpenetration, the damage was catastrophic beyond description. Johnston's after third became a nightmare of twisted metal and flooding spaces. Yamato's secondary battery fired simultaneously with her main guns. 6.1-inch shells hammered Johnston's superstructure with devastating results. One shell struck amidships. The anti-aircraft fire director vanished in the explosion. Its crew died instantly. 2 more shells hit forward. The torpedo director disintegrated. The bridge became a scene of indescribable carnage. Steel splinters flew like deadly rain. Body parts scattered across twisted metal. Commander Evans was hurled off his feet by the concussion. 2 fingers of his left hand were severed by flying steel fragments. The explosion literally tore his uniform shirt from his body. His chest and face were peppered with countless small metal pieces. Most of his bridge crew died where they stood. Navigator Lieutenant Ed DeGardy lost part of his left hand to shrapnel. Jagged metal had sliced through bone and flesh. The helmsman took wounds but stayed at his post. Training and instinct kept him functioning. His hands remained steady on the wheel. The quartermaster died at his station. Blood covered every surface of what remained of the bridge. Power was lost to 3 main gun turrets. Steering control was severed. Engines were crippled. Half the bridge crew lay dead or wounded. Johnston should have been finished. Standard naval doctrine demanded immediate retreat. Any destroyer suffering such damage would normally withdraw or face certain destruction. But Evans was not a standard officer. Johnston's crew was not a standard crew. Damage control parties moved with desperate efficiency. Endless training drills had prepared them for this moment. Within 10 minutes, they had jury-rigged emergency cables. Electrical power flowed to the 2 forward gun turrets once again. Steering control was re-established at the emergency station on the fantail. Evans, despite severe wounds and significant blood loss, refused medical treatment. He waved away anything beyond minimal field dressing to stop the bleeding. He ordered all medical supplies saved for wounded crew members. "Save the medicine for men who need it more than I do," he told the ship's doctor. Evans relocated his command from the shattered bridge to the fantail. Manual steering was now being conducted from this exposed position. He shouted steering orders through an open hatch. Sailors manually turned the rudder by hand. They cranked the heavy mechanism that normally operated through hydraulic power. Johnston remained in the fight. She was reduced to 17 knots. 3 of her 5 guns were out of action. Half her crew lay dead or wounded. Yet she remained combat effective through sheer determination. Her crew's willpower and their captain's refusal to quit kept her fighting. Over the next 2 hours, Johnston would continue engaging target after target. Japanese shells would eventually send her to the bottom. At this critical moment, USS Hoel and USS Heermann began their own torpedo runs. The 4 destroyer escorts followed shortly after. These converging attacks created complete chaos in the Japanese formation. Enemy ships had been steaming in cruising formation. This arrangement was optimized for speed and mutual support. It was not designed for maneuvering combat. The aggressive American attacks forced Japanese ships to maneuver independently. They had to dodge torpedoes. Coordinated fire plans broke down completely. Command and control became confused and fragmented. Japanese commanders had expected to steamroll the American carriers. They planned to use overwhelming firepower to crush resistance quickly. Instead, they found themselves dodging torpedoes. They maneuvered to avoid collisions. They lost track of enemy positions. Their own ships' locations became uncertain in the smoke and rain. USS Hoel was commanded by Commander Leon S. Kintberger. She charged directly toward the Japanese battleships in the center of their formation. At 7:43, she launched a half-salvo of 5 torpedoes. Battleship Congo was the target at 9,000 yards range. The battleship turned hard to starboard. She avoided the torpedo spread by combing them. She presented her narrow bow and let the weapons pass harmlessly down her length. But the maneuver forced Congo to cease firing temporarily. She was taken out of position in the formation. At 7:54, Hoel fired her remaining 5 torpedoes at heavy cruiser Haguro. The range was under 6,000 yards. This was terrifyingly close in naval combat terms. At least 1 torpedo struck Haguro in her engineering spaces. Flooding began immediately. The cruiser was forced to reduce speed for damage control. But Hoel paid a terrible price for her audacity. Japanese shells began hammering the destroyer as she made her approach. Over the next 45 minutes, Hoel absorbed over 40 major-caliber hits. Battleship and cruiser guns pounded her mercilessly. Her bridge was destroyed by an 8-inch shell. Most of the officers stationed there were killed instantly. Her forward engine room flooded from hits below the waterline. Her No. 2 gun mount was blown off its foundation. The entire turret disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris. All steering control was lost. The ship had to be conned from the emergency steering station aft. All power was lost when her remaining engine room flooded. At 8:30, with his ship dead in the water, Commander Kintberger ordered abandon ship. Hoel was listing heavily and sinking by the bow. She rolled over onto her port side at 8:55. She sank stern first. Of her crew of 273 officers and men, only 86 survived. 187 died. Some were killed by shell hits. Others drowned when the ship sank. Still others were taken by sharks during the 2 days survivors spent in the water awaiting rescue. USS Heermann was commanded by Commander Amos T. Hathaway. She executed perhaps the most daring single maneuver of the entire battle. At 7:54, she launched her full spread of torpedoes at battleship Haruna. The range was 4,400 yards. Less than 2.5 miles separated the ships. The torpedoes missed as Haruna turned hard to avoid them. But the battleship was forced to turn away from the carriers. she was temporarily taken out of effective gun range. Moments later, Hirman found herself trapped between two columns of Japanese heavy cruisers. They were closing from different directions. With suicidal courage and remarkable ship-handling skill, Hathaway steered Hirman directly between battleship Congo and heavy cruiser Chikuma. She crossed both ships' bows at point-blank range. This was a textbook crossing of the T-maneuver executed in reverse. The Japanese ships faced an American destroyer suddenly appearing directly between them. Ranges were less than 5,000 yards. They were forced to turn hard to avoid collision. In doing so, they masked each other's gunfire. They lost track of Hirman in the confusion. Hirman escaped the trap with damage from several near misses. No direct hits struck her. She had forced two major Japanese units to break off their pursuit of the carriers. Her aggressive attack and brilliant seamanship had disrupted the Japanese formation at a critical moment. Throughout the battle, Hirman continued engaging targets of opportunity. Her 5-inch guns scored hits on multiple cruisers. The damage caused was relatively minor against their armored hulls. The 4 destroyer escorts were designed for anti-submarine warfare. They were never intended for surface combat against heavy ships. They followed the destroyers into battle after initial hesitation. At 7:42, Rear Admiral Sprague ordered the Little Wolves to attack. This was the radio call sign for destroyer escorts. The initial order was somewhat ambiguous. The destroyer escort commanders were unsure of their mission. Were they supposed to join the destroyer's coordinated attack? Should they conduct a separate attack? After several minutes of confusion, Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland made his decision. He commanded USS Samuel B. Roberts. He decided to act independently, rather than wait for clarification. He ordered his ship to follow the destroyers into battle. Samuel B. Roberts was the smallest of the small boys. She displaced only 1,350 tons fully loaded. She was about the size of a World War I destroyer. Copeland had pushed his ship beyond her design limits. He was trying to keep pace with the larger destroyers. He dangerously overpressured her boilers to 660 pounds per square inch. The design limit was 440 pounds. The engineering crew maintained this pressure for over an hour. They gambled that the boilers would not explode. They coaxed 28.7 knots from a ship designed for a maximum speed of 24 knots. Black smoke poured from Roberts's stack. Her boilers strained beyond their design capacity. Before ordering his ship into battle, Copeland addressed his crew. He used the ship's public address system. His words would become legendary in Navy lore. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. The words were matter of fact. They were not dramatic. Copeland simply stated the tactical reality. Every man aboard already understood their situation. They were charging toward heavy cruisers in a ship designed to fight submarines. Their chances of survival were minimal. Their duty was clear. The carriers had to be protected, regardless of cost. At 8:10, Samuel B. Roberts launched her 3 Mark 15 torpedoes. Heavy cruiser Chokai was the target at approximately 4,000 yards. This was close enough that her 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns could engage Chokai's superstructure directly. Sailors manning the smaller weapons raked the cruiser's upper works with automatic fire. Windows shattered under the hail of bullets. Exposed personnel were killed or wounded. One torpedo struck Chokai's stern engineering spaces. The damage was catastrophic to her propulsion system. A 500-pound bomb hit from a Taffy 2 aircraft struck minutes later. It detonated in her engine room. Combined damage left Chokai dead in the water. Uncontrollable flooding began immediately. Destroyer Fujinami later scuttled the crippled cruiser with torpedoes. Roberts had achieved what her designers never imagined possible. A destroyer escort had mission-killed a heavy cruiser. That enemy ship was armed with 8 8-inch guns. Roberts then engaged heavy cruiser Chikuma in an extended gun duel. Ranges fluctuated between 5,000 and 7,000 yards. Her 2 5-inch guns fired 608 rounds in 35 minutes. This was a sustained rate of fire of over 17 rounds per minute per gun. The performance was astonishing for manually loaded weapons. The gun crews worked with machine-like precision. They loaded, fired, and loaded again in a rhythm that never slowed. Japanese shells exploded all around them. The pace never decreased. The aftergun mount was designated Mount 52. It was commanded by Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr. This 24-year-old sailor was from Chakotah, Oklahoma. Carr's gun crew maintained their incredible rate of fire even after losing electrical power. They manually cranked the turret into position. They hand-loaded each 54-pound shell into the breech. At approximately 8:50, a Japanese 8-inch shell struck Mount 52. It penetrated the thin gun shield and exploded inside the mount. The blast killed or wounded most of the crew instantly. The gun itself remained functional. Carr, though horribly wounded, refused to abandon his post. His gun continued firing. At 8:51, disaster struck. A powder charge cooked off in the overheated breech. It detonated prematurely as it was being loaded. The explosion destroyed the gun mount completely. The barrel shattered. The breech mechanism blew apart. Carr was caught directly in the blast. He suffered catastrophic wounds. Witnesses described them as ripping him open from neck to groin. When rescue parties reached Mount 52 after the abandoned ship order, they found Carr dying at his post. He was still holding the mount's final shell. He begged with his last breath for someone to load it. He wanted the gun to keep firing. He died moments later. Carr was posthumously awarded the Silver Star for his actions. USS Carr FFG-52 was named in his honor. This Oliver Hazard Perry class frigate was commissioned in 1985. At 8:51, an 8-inch shell from Chikuma penetrated Samuel B. Roberts below the waterline. It exploded in the forward engine room. The blast was catastrophic. The engine room was a confined space packed with high-pressure steam lines. Fuel lines and machinery filled every available area. The explosion ruptured everything simultaneously. Steam at 600 degrees scalded men to death instantly. Fuel oil ignited, creating an inferno. Water flooded in through the hole blown in the hull. The engine room became a death trap. Most personnel stationed there died within seconds. The ship's main engines and generators were destroyed. Samuel B. Roberts lost all power. She began flooding rapidly. At 9:09, a second shell struck near the after 5-inch mount. More men were killed. At 9:10, with his ship dead in the water, Lieutenant Commander Copeland ordered abandon ship. She was flooding uncontrollably and sinking. Samuel B. Roberts capsized and sank at approximately 10:05. Of her crew of 224 officers and men, 89 were killed in action. An additional 25 died from wounds exposure or shark attacks. Survivors spent 2 days in the water. 120 men ultimately survived. Many bore wounds and psychological scars they would carry for life. The destroyer escorts Dennis John C. Butler and Raymond conducted their own attacks. They fired their limited torpedo loads at Japanese cruisers. While they scored no confirmed hits, their aggressive actions contributed materially to the chaos. They disrupted the Japanese formation. They also laid massive amounts of smoke. These created fog banks that degraded Japanese optical fire control. They provided intermittent concealment for the carriers. The small boys had accomplished their mission. Through sacrifice and audacity, they had disrupted the Japanese attack. They bought time for the carriers. They sunk or damaged multiple enemy ships. But the cost was terrible. Their ordeal was far from over. Throughout these surface actions, American aircraft swarmed over the Japanese ships. They launched continuous attacks that historians would later describe as some of the most courageous flying of the Pacific War. Taffy Threes pilots faced an impossible situation. Their aircraft carried ordnance meant for ground targets. Naval armor was beyond their weapons' capability. Many Avengers had already expended their torpedoes. They had launched pre-dawn strikes against Japanese positions ashore. The Wildcat fighters carried machine guns effective against aircraft. These weapons were useless against battleship armor. Some pilots attacked with depth charges. These were cylindrical weapons designed to explode underwater near submarines. Against surface ships, depth charges were nearly worthless. Pilots dropped them anyway. They hoped to cause some damage. At minimum, they could distract Japanese gunners. Yet, the pilots pressed home attack after attack. Their courage bordered on insanity. Young ensigns and lieutenants, with fewer than 200 hours of total flight time, dove on the most powerful battleships ever built. They made run after run. They attacked from different angles. Some flew through walls of anti-aircraft fire so thick it seemed impossible to penetrate. When their bombs and torpedoes were gone, they made dry runs. They dove at Japanese ships without weapons. This forced enemy commanders to maneuver. It spoiled their gunnery. The psychological effect on Japanese commanders proved profound. Vice Admiral Kurita watched wave after wave of American aircraft attacking his ships. He became convinced he faced fleet carriers. These were not escort carriers. The ferocity and persistence of the air attacks seemed impossible from the small jeep carriers he had been briefed about. The coordination between different squadrons suggested a much larger force. Pilots from Taffy II joined the battle as word spread. Rear Admiral Felix Stump commanded Taffy II. He immediately ordered his squadrons rearmed with heavier weapons. Avengers were loaded with Mark 13 torpedoes and 500-pound general-purpose bombs. These were the heaviest ordnance available. Within 30 minutes of Sprague's initial distress call, Taffy II launched strike after strike. Throughout the 90-minute surface battle, Taffy II launched 3 full strikes. These totaled over 70 sorties against Kurita's force. These attacks proved devastating. The concentrated airstrikes sank 3 Japanese heavy cruisers. Others were damaged. Japanese command and control was disrupted throughout the battle. At approximately 8:20 aircraft from Taffy II hit heavy cruiser Suzuya. A near miss detonated her starboard forward torpedo tubes. The Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes each carried 1,080 pounds of high explosive. They detonated in a chain reaction. The explosions blew massive holes in Suzuya's hull. Uncontrollable fires started immediately. The cruiser's damage control parties fought desperately. They tried to contain the fires and flooding. The damage was too severe. Around noon, fires were raging out of control. Ammunition began to cook off. Suzuya was abandoned. She sank at approximately 13:20. Heavy cruiser Chikuma was already damaged by Samuel B. Roberts's gunfire. She was hit by multiple torpedoes from Taffy II aircraft. The torpedoes opened her hull to the sea. Chikuma began sinking slowly. Her crew abandoned ship as she settled lower in the water. Destroyer Nowaki took aboard survivors before heading north to rejoin the fleet. Chikuma sank that afternoon. Heavy cruiser Chokai was dead in the water. Roberts's torpedo and the bomb hit to her engine room had crippled her. She was scuttled by Japanese destroyers with torpedo hits. They preferred this to leaving her for American salvage. The escort carriers themselves became direct targets. Japanese ships closed range despite the smoke screens and maneuvering. USS Gambier Bay was positioned on the port flank of the carrier formation. She fell behind the other carriers as the chase continued. Her engines were stressed beyond their design limits. She could not maintain the pace. Captain Walter V.R. Vieweg was known as Bowser for his pugnacious personality. He watched helplessly as the distance between his ship and the others gradually increased. By 8:00, Gambier Bay had become isolated. She was a straggler, separated from the protection of the formation. At 8:07, Japanese heavy cruisers, Chikuma Ton and Haguro, concentrated their fire on the struggling carrier. Ranges were approximately 15,000 yards. Their 8-inch shells began finding the range. At 8:10, Chikuma's shells hit Gambier Bay's after-flight deck. Fires started immediately. More hits followed in rapid succession. At 8:20, a shell penetrated below the waterline near the forward engine room. Catastrophic flooding began. The explosion opened the bulkhead between compartments. Seawater rushed in with tremendous force. The forward engine room flooded completely. Most of the personnel stationed there were killed. Gambier Bay lost the use of one engine. Her speed dropped from 18 knots to 11 knots. She fell further behind. She was now isolated and defenseless. Johnston, despite her crippled condition, attempted to draw fire away from Gambier Bay. Commander Evans was still commanding from the fantail. He ordered his 2 remaining operational guns to engage the Japanese cruisers. They were hammering the carrier mercilessly. Johnston's shells struck Chikuma and Ton. The damage caused was minor, but both cruisers were forced to temporarily shift fire. 3 cruisers firing from close range could not be deterred for long. The cruiser's shells continued to hammer Gambier Bay. Multiple hits struck her engine spaces, her hangar deck, her hull. Fires raged throughout the riddled carrier. At 8:40, Gambier Bay was dead in the water. She was listing heavily to port with fires visible throughout her structure. At 8:50, Captain Vieweg ordered abandon ship. The crew began going over the sides into the warm waters of the Philippine Sea. At 9:07, Gambier Bay capsized to port. Her keel appeared above the surface. Survivors in the water could clearly see shell holes in her underwater hull. The port propeller was missing. It had been blown off by one of the hits. She remained floating inverted for only 4 minutes. At 9:11, USS Gambier Bay sank. She disappeared beneath the surface in less than a minute. From first hit to final sinking, only 61 minutes had elapsed. She was the only American fleet or light carrier sunk by surface gunfire during World War II. Of her crew of approximately 800, 147 were killed immediately. They died from shell hits or drowned when the ship sank. Many more would die in the water over the following 2 days. Nearly 700 men went into the water as Gambier Bay sank. They would spend 50 hours floating in shark-infested seas before rescue craft found them. The other carriers suffered heavy damage, but remained afloat. Desperate maneuvering smoke screens and the sacrificial attacks of their escorts kept them alive. USS Kalinin Bay was hit 15 times by shells ranging from 5-inch to 14-inch caliber. One 14-inch armor-piercing shell from battleship Congo passed completely through the carrier from port to starboard without exploding. The delayed action fuse failed to trigger. The massive projectile left holes 4 feet in diameter in both sides of the ship. It caused surprisingly little damage between entry and exit points. Had it exploded, Kalinin Bay would have been destroyed instantly. Other hits killed and wounded crew members. They started fires and caused flooding. Damage control parties contained the damage. Kalinin Bay survived. USS White Plains sustained multiple near misses and at least one direct hit. Her crew kept her engines running and her steering functional. USS Fanshawe Bay was Admiral Sprague's flagship. She dodged over 100 near misses through radical maneuvering. Sprague personally directed these maneuvers from the flag bridge. The Admiral's calm voice over the radio helped maintain morale throughout Taffy 3. He directed his task unit with steady commands despite shells exploding around his ship. The carrier's single 5-inch stern guns engaged Japanese cruisers whenever targets came within their 18,000-yard maximum range. The little guns scored hits on several cruisers. They caused minor damage to superstructures. Nothing approached critical damage against armored warships. Nevertheless, the return fire forced Japanese ships to maneuver. This contributed marginally to the general disruption of their attack. At approximately 8:45, crippled and surrounded by Japanese destroyers, USS Johnston made her final heroic charge. Commander Evans had observed Japanese light cruiser Yahagi and destroyers Isokaze, Yukikaze, Urakaze, and Nowaki forming up for a coordinated torpedo attack on the carriers. Despite having only one operational gun turret, Johnston prepared for her last fight. One barely functional engine produced perhaps 10 knots. Steering was controlled by men manually cranking the rudder. Evans turned Johnston toward the 5 enemy ships. It was suicide. Every man aboard knew it. The carriers needed protection desperately. Johnston's last working gun kept firing. The crew loaded shells as fast as their hands could move. Each shot found its mark on Yahagi. Shell after shell slammed into the Japanese cruiser. But Japanese destroyers closed in from all sides. They surrounded Johnston like wolves circling wounded prey. Their guns blazed from point-blank distance. The range was so close, sailors could see faces across the water. 5-inch shells tore into Johnston's hull. The destroyer shuddered under each impact. Metal screamed as projectiles ripped through steel plating. Explosions echoed through her compartments. Fire and smoke poured from dozens of wounds. The time was 9:10 in the morning. Every gun had fallen silent. Both engines lay destroyed in twisted wreckage. Fires burned throughout the ship. Orange flames licked at bulkheads. Smoke choked the air in every space. The entire vessel listed heavily to one side. Water poured through holes in her hull. Pumps couldn't keep up with the flooding. The sea claimed more of the ship with each passing minute. Commander Evans made the hardest decision of his naval career. He ordered abandon ship. The words carried across the vessel through voice tubes and speaking trumpets. Men began going over the sides immediately. They climbed railings and jumped into warm tropical water. Some slid down lines. Others simply leaped from wherever they stood. Every sailor swam away from the sinking destroyer as fast as his arms could carry him. At exactly 10:10 in the morning, USS Johnston rolled over. Her port side disappeared beneath the surface first. The massive hull turned turtle slowly. Water rushed into every opening. She sank with frightening speed. Sailors on the Japanese destroyer Yukikaze witnessed something remarkable. They came on deck as Johnston went down. Every man stood at rigid attention. They rendered a formal salute to the sinking American warship. The gesture showed profound respect for Johnston's crew. Multiple Japanese accounts recorded this moment. Even enemies recognized the extraordinary courage they had witnessed. Such honor between adversaries was rare in the Pacific War. Commander Ernest Evans was seen in the water. He floated in his life jacket among other survivors. But rescue ships never found him. The sea claimed the Cherokee warrior who had led Johnston's magnificent charge. Johnston's crew numbered 327 officers and men. Only 141 lived through the battle and rescue. The mathematics were brutal and final. 186 died in the engagement. Some were killed instantly by shell fire. Others drowned when the ship sank beneath them. Many more were taken by sharks during the long hours waiting for rescue. The warm waters around Samar teemed with predators drawn by blood and bodies. Evans received the Medal of Honor posthumously. He became the first Native American in United States Navy history to earn the nation's highest decoration for valor. The citation captured his extraordinary leadership. It praised his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity. His actions went far beyond the call of duty. As commanding officer, he faced major units of the enemy Japanese fleet. The battle occurred off Samar in those desperate morning hours. Evans was first to lay smoke screens. He was first to open fire as the enemy task force approached. He gallantly diverted powerful hostile guns away from the lightly armed escort carriers under his protection. He launched the first torpedo attack even as Johnston came under heavy Japanese shell fire. At 9:25, something miraculous happened. After nearly 2.5 hours of continuous combat, the Japanese attack suddenly faltered. Vice Admiral Kurita saw his command and control system collapse completely. Aggressive American destroyer attacks had disrupted his formations. Continuous airstrikes hammered his ships from above. Confusion about enemy forces clouded his judgment. Communications between Japanese ships had broken down entirely. Individual captains made their own decisions. They chased whatever targets appeared closest. No coordinated plan existed anymore. The careful Japanese battle formation had disintegrated into chaos. Kurita feared he faced the main American carrier force. He worried that heavy battleships lurked nearby ready to trap his scattered fleet. Intelligence had been wrong before. Perhaps it was wrong again. At 9:25, he ordered general retirement northward. All ships were to reform and regroup. The massive Japanese force began turning away from the carriers they had been about to destroy. Kurita didn't realize how close victory had been. Complete and total victory lay within his grasp. He was minutes away from accomplishing his mission. The American destroyers were sunk or sinking rapidly. The destroyer escorts had fired their last torpedoes. Ammunition ran critically low on every ship. Battle damage slowed the smaller vessels. The escort carriers were nearly out of fuel. Aviation gasoline reserves approached empty. Bombs and torpedoes for aircraft were almost expended. The pilots flew on fumes and determination alone. Gambier Bay was already sinking beneath the waves. The other carriers suffered damage that reduced their speed. Hull plates buckled from near misses. Compartments flooded through sprung seams. Another 30 minutes of sustained attack would have destroyed Taffy Threes completely. Nothing could have saved them. Leyte Gulf's invasion beaches would have been defenseless against Japanese battleship fire. Instead, Kurita withdrew his overwhelming force. The decision remains controversial among military historians 8 decades later. Some argue Kurita lost his nerve after nearly drowning when his flagship was torpedoed earlier in the campaign. Others suggest excessive caution ruled his thinking. He couldn't accept casualties in pursuit of decisive victory. Still, others contend his decision was reasonable given incomplete information available at that moment. From the American perspective, The withdrawal seemed impossible to believe. Nobody could comprehend what they were witnessing. Aboard USS Fanshawe Bay, a signalman stood near Admiral Sprague. He called out words that captured the surreal moment perfectly. "God damn it, boys, they're getting away." Officers and crew members stared in disbelief. Massive Japanese battleships and cruisers were turning northward. They were steaming away from carriers they had been on the verge of destroying. Victory was being handed to the Americans. Sprague himself couldn't believe his eyes. He had been absolutely certain his entire force would be annihilated within minutes. His after-action report filed days later reflected his amazement at the impossible outcome. The success of Taffy Three was nothing short of special dispensation from the Lord Almighty, Sprague wrote. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz would later echo this sentiment in his official assessment. He added his own observation that Taffy Three's survival defied all rational tactical analysis. But there was no time for relief or celebration yet. At 10:50, even as Taffy Three recovered from the surface action, a new threat appeared from the western sky. 5 Japanese aircraft approached at low altitude. They climbed to approximately 2,500 feet above the water. Then they dove directly toward the American carriers below. These were not conventional bombing attacks. The pilots had no intention of pulling out of their dives. They were aiming their entire aircraft at American ships like guided missiles. The divine wind had arrived. The Kamikaze Special Attack Corps was making its first organized appearance of the war. Suicide attacks would become the signature tactic of Japan's final desperate months. One Mitsubishi fighter crashed into USS Kitkun Bay's port side. The impact occurred near the waterline where damage would be most severe. The aircraft's bomb exploded on contact, blowing a hole in the carrier's hull. Water poured into the ship through the jagged opening. Flooding spread to adjacent compartments. But the damage was not immediately fatal to the vessel. Kitkun Bay's crew fought the flooding with skill and determination. Damage control parties sealed off flooded spaces. Pumps worked to remove water faster than it entered. The ship remained operational despite her wounds. Another kamikaze targeted USS White Plains directly. Concentrated anti-aircraft fire met the diving plane. Tracers filled the air around the approaching fighter. Multiple hits tore into the aircraft before it reached its target. The plane exploded in mid-air above the carrier. Burning wreckage crashed into the sea just short of White Plains. Debris showered the flight deck and superstructure, but no significant damage resulted from the near miss. USS St. Lowe was not as fortunate in avoiding catastrophe. At 10:53, a Zero fighter piloted by Lieutenant Yukio Seki dove through heavy anti-aircraft fire. Flak bursts surrounded the plane but couldn't stop its approach. The fighter crashed through St. Lowe's wooden flight deck near the center line. The aircraft penetrated deep into the ship before its 250-kilogram bomb detonated. The explosion occurred inside the hangar deck, where aviation gasoline and armed ordnance waited to be loaded. Secondary explosions tore through the ship immediately. Bombs and torpedoes cooked off in the intense heat. Each explosion triggered more explosions in a deadly chain reaction. Within minutes, flames consumed St. Lowe from bow to stern. Fire spread faster than damage control parties could contain it. The inferno raged through every deck and compartment. At 11:25, with fires raging completely out of control, Captain Francis McKenna ordered abandon ship. Major explosions were occurring every few minutes. The ship was doomed beyond any hope of salvation. St. Lowe exploded in a massive fireball at 11:25. She sank within minutes, becoming the first major American warship destroyed by a kamikaze attack. The psychological impact would haunt American sailors for the remainder of the war. But in October 1944, the suicide tactic was completely new. Its full implications were not yet understood by either side. Taffy 3 had survived both the surface attack and the kamikaze strike. The cost was staggering beyond imagination. 4 ships were lost in surface combat: USS Johnston, USS Howell, USS Samuel B. Roberts, and USS Gambier Bay all rested on the ocean floor. The escort carrier USS St. Lo lay destroyed by kamikaze attack. Multiple other ships suffered battle damage. Some wounds were severe enough to require months of repair. American casualties totaled 1,161, killed and missing. Another 913 men were wounded but survived their injuries. The price of victory was paid in blood and courage. The survivors who abandoned ship spent up to 50 hours floating in tropical waters. The Philippine Sea was warm, but offered no mercy to men clinging to wreckage. Rescue ships searched vast areas of ocean looking for survivors. Many men died from wounds during the long wait. Others succumbed to exposure despite the warm water. Dehydration became critical under the relentless tropical sun. Some died from shark attack while awaiting rescue. The waters off Samar were heavily populated with sharks. The warm temperature and abundant food sources attracted large numbers of predators. Survivors reported seeing sharks constantly during their time in the water. Some men simply disappeared. They were pulled under by predators without warning. Others died from wounds that would have been survivable with immediate medical care. Hours in salt water made injuries fatal. But Taffy 3 had accomplished its mission completely and decisively. The invasion beaches at Leyte Gulf remained secure from naval bombardment. General Douglas MacArthur's 13,000 troops continued landing unopposed. The Japanese center force, despite its overwhelming superiority and firepower, had been turned back. They never reached their primary objective. The invasion proceeded according to plan. Kurita's force continued north after breaking off the attack. They hovered in the waters off Samar for several hours, attempting to regroup. Damage assessment and reorganization took time. He changed course multiple times. Due north, then west, then southwest, then back to north again. Uncertainty about American forces and his own capabilities influenced every decision. At approximately 1:10 in the afternoon, it became apparent to American observers that Kurita was heading away from Leyte Gulf permanently. He transited back through San Bernardino Strait that night, returning westward toward Brunei. American aircraft from Admiral Halsey's fast carriers pursued the retreating Japanese force. Air attacks continued throughout the afternoon and evening of October 25th. Dive bombers and torpedo planes struck whenever weather permitted. Light cruiser Noshiro was sunk by air attack. Multiple bomb hits broke her back and sent her to the bottom. Destroyer Hiroshima was damaged severely and had to be beached on the coast of Samar. Destroyer Nowaki, carrying survivors from heavy cruiser Chikuma, ran into American cruisers during the night transit. USS Denver, USS Miami, and USS Biloxi intercepted the Japanese destroyer in San Bernardino Strait. The American cruisers crippled Nowaki with rapid gunfire. Salvos from 6-inch guns tore the destroyer apart. USS Owen finished her with torpedo strikes. Nowaki sank with all hands, including the Chikuma survivors. Over 1,200 men went down with the ship. The sea claimed them in the darkness of San Bernardino Strait. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest naval engagement in human history. It surpassed all previous battles measured by tonnage of ships engaged. The geographic area covered was immense. Strategic consequences were decisive. Over 2,000 personnel participated in the action. The battle area encompassed approximately 100,000 square miles of ocean. The Japanese Navy deployed virtually every operational warship remaining in its inventory. The Americans committed major elements of both 3rd and 7th Fleets. Hundreds of ships converged on the waters around the Philippines. The scale was unprecedented in naval warfare. The battle actually consisted of 4 separate major engagements. They were fought over 4 days across 500 miles of ocean. Each action was decisive in its own right. The Battle of the Sibuyan Sea on October 24th saw American carrier aircraft sink the super battleship Musashi. Repeated air attacks overwhelmed her defenses despite massive anti-aircraft armament. The Battle of Surigao Strait, on the night of October 24th to 25th, saw American battleships annihilate the Japanese southern force. It was the last battleship versus battleship engagement in naval history. The Battle of Cape Engano, on October 25th, saw Admiral Halsey's carriers sink all 4 of Ozawa's carriers. The Japanese carrier force was destroyed as an effective fighting unit. The Battle of Samar on the morning of October 25th saw Taffy Threes' desperate stand against the center force. It was the most improbable victory in naval history. The Japanese Navy lost 26 warships, totaling 36,000 tons displacement. 3 battleships were sunk: Musashi in the Sibuyan Sea, Yamashiro and Fuso at Surigao Strait. 4 aircraft carriers were destroyed. Zuikaku, Zuiho Chitos, and Chiyoda all went down at Cape Engano. 10 cruisers were sunk, including 3 off Samar. 9 destroyers were lost. Over 2,500 Japanese sailors died in the 4-day battle. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again sortie as a major fleet. Fuel shortages, damage to surviving ships, and loss of trained personnel reduced the Navy to a purely defensive force. The Americans lost 6 ships, totaling 37,000 tons displacement. Light carrier USS Princeton was sunk by Japanese air attack on October 24th. 2 escort carriers USS Gambier Bay and USS St. Lo were lost at Samar. 2 destroyers USS Johnston and USS Hoel were sunk at Samar. 1 destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts was sunk at Samar. American casualties totaled 2,800 killed and 913 wounded across all engagements. The strategic victory was complete and decisive beyond question. The Japanese Navy had gambled everything on Operation Shogo 1 and lost catastrophically. Japan's ability to conduct offensive naval operations ended at Leyte Gulf. The Battle of Samar stands apart in naval history for its sheer improbability. Never before or since has such a mismatch in forces resulted in such an outcome. The mathematics defied conventional analysis. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers faced 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The tonnage ratio was approximately 10-1 favoring the Japanese force. The firepower ratio was even more lopsided in Japan's favor. Yamato's main battery alone could deliver more shell weight in a single salvo than all of Taffy Threes' guns combined could fire in 5 minutes. Yet the smaller force not only survived the engagement, it forced the larger force to withdraw without accomplishing its mission. The outcome violated every principle of naval warfare. How did this seemingly impossible result occur? Tactical analysis reveals multiple contributing factors. Each was necessary, but none alone was sufficient to explain the outcome. First, the aggressive American destroyer attacks disrupted Japanese formation integrity at the critical moment. Kurita's ships had been steaming in formation, optimized for fuel efficiency and mutual support during the long approach march. The formation was not configured for immediate combat operations. The sudden need to maneuver independently to avoid American torpedoes scattered the careful arrangement. Ships maneuvered without coordination. Each captain made independent decisions based on his own situation. The result was chaos that degraded Japanese ability to mass fires effectively. Ships masked each other's lines of fire constantly. Communications broke down as radio circuits became overloaded with conflicting reports and orders. Individual Japanese commanders lost track of both American positions and their own fleet's dispositions. The smoke screens laid by American destroyers and destroyer escorts compounded this confusion dramatically. Visibility was reduced to almost zero in many areas. Japanese optical fire control systems depended on clear sight lines to function effectively. Second American radar directed gunnery proved far superior to Japanese optical fire control systems under the conditions that prevailed off Samar that morning. The Mark 37 fire control director, linked to a Mark 1A computer, gave American destroyers continuous accurate firing solutions. This advantage persisted despite smoke rain rapidly changing ranges and violent maneuvering by all ships. Johnston Hole and Heermann scored repeated hits on Japanese ships from ranges and in conditions where Japanese return fire struggled for accuracy. The technological edge partially offset the American disadvantage in gun caliber and ship size. Japanese fire control depended primarily on optical rangefinders. These were sophisticated instruments that functioned superbly under ideal conditions, but they degraded rapidly when visibility was reduced by smoke or weather. The smoke and rain squalls off Samar created conditions where American radar gave a decisive advantage in gunnery accuracy. Third American damage control proved superior to Japanese practices. This kept American ships fighting longer despite critical battle damage. Johnston fought effectively for over 2 hours after losing half her propulsion. She continued engaging enemy ships after losing 3 of 5 gun mounts. Massive flooding in multiple compartments didn't stop her guns from firing. The crew's training in damage control, combined with good compartmentation in American ship designs, paid decisive dividends. Kalinin Bay survived 15 shell hits, including a 14-inch projectile that passed completely through her hull. The crew kept her operational, despite catastrophic damage. She remained in formation and continued flight operations. Japanese damage control was less effective, partly due to different design philosophies. Japanese ships emphasized offensive firepower over defensive survivability. Less emphasis was placed on damage control training compared to American practices. When American destroyers scored hits on Japanese cruisers, the damage often proved more severe than comparable hits on American ships. Superior damage control kept American vessels in the fight longer. Fourth Japanese armor-piercing shells designed to penetrate battleship armor over-penetrated the thin hulls of American destroyers and escort carriers. This reduced their destructive effect significantly. The armor-piercing projectiles were designed with delayed action fuses. These triggered detonation after penetrating several inches of steel armor. Against battleship armor belts 8 to 16 inches thick, this worked perfectly. Against destroyer hulls a fraction of an inch thick, the shells often passed completely through before detonating. This reduced the damage they caused inside the ship dramatically. Had the Japanese been firing high-explosive shells designed for unarmored targets, the results would have been catastrophically different. Instantaneous fuses that detonated on contact would have torn massive holes in thin-hulled ships. Every hit would have caused far more damage. The fact that many Japanese shells over-penetrated was simply fortunate for the Americans. Different ammunition would have destroyed Taffy 3 quickly. Fifth American air attacks maintained continuous pressure throughout the battle. This forced Japanese ships to maneuver constantly and diverted attention from surface targets. Even after bombs and torpedoes were expended, pilots made dry runs. These fake attacks forced Japanese ships to turn and maneuver, spoiling their gunnery solutions. The psychological pressure from continuous air attack combined with Kurita's fear of facing more powerful American forces. This contributed significantly to his decision to withdraw from the battle area. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was heavy, but not overwhelmingly effective. American pilots pressed attacks with determination despite taking casualties. But the fundamental factor that explains Taffy Threes' survival was human courage executed with such ferocity that it convinced the enemy they faced a much more powerful force than actually opposed them. Commander Ernest Evans charged toward Yamato without orders. He understood instinctively that aggressive action was the only chance for survival. Passive defense would have meant certain annihilation. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland took Samuel B. Roberts into battle against heavy cruisers. He knew survival was impossible, but attack was necessary. The destroyer escort had to buy time for the carriers. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague ordered his destroyers to conduct suicide torpedo runs. Delaying the Japanese advance even briefly might save the escort carriers. Every minute gained was precious. These decisions were not made from positions of strength. They came from complete desperation, but they were executed with such total commitment and ferocity that they convinced Vice Admiral Kurita he faced fleet carriers and heavy units. The Japanese had been trained in Mahanian naval doctrine, emphasizing decisive fleet actions between battleships. They expected their opponents to maneuver cautiously, preserving strength for the climactic engagement. Weaker forces were supposed to retreat when confronted by superior strength. They were not supposed to attack suicidally against overwhelming odds. The American destroyers violated every assumption about how a weaker force should behave. They attacked with complete aggression, closing to point-blank range. They fought until their ships literally sank beneath them. This behavior was incomprehensible within the Japanese tactical framework. It caused confusion and uncertainty that contributed materially to Kurita's belief that he faced a much larger force. The audacity of the American attack convinced him he was walking into a trap. The aftermath of the battle produced immediate recognition of the extraordinary valor displayed by Taffy Three. The entire task unit was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. This is one of the highest unit decorations the United States can bestow. The citation praised extraordinary heroism in action against powerful units of the Japanese fleet. It noted specifically that 2 destroyers and 1 destroyer escort charged the battleships point-blank. They expended their last torpedoes in desperate defense of the entire group. They went down under heavy enemy shells as a climax to 2.5 hours of sustained furious combat. Commander Ernest Evans posthumously received the Medal of Honor. His citation emphasized his role as first to lay smoke screens and open fire. He launched the first torpedo attack when Johnston came under straddling Japanese shell fire. The citation concluded that his valiant fighting spirit throughout this historic battle will endure as an inspiration to all who served with him. In 2023, 80 years after his death, Secretary of the Navy Carlos del Toro officially confirmed Evans was the first Native American in United States Navy history to receive the Medal of Honor. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland received the Navy Cross for his leadership of Samuel B. Roberts. Commander Leon Kintberger of Howell received a posthumous Navy Cross. Commander Amos Hathaway of Herman received the Navy Cross for his ship's aggressive actions. Dozens of Silver Stars and Bronze Stars were awarded to other officers and crew members. Many historians believe more Medals of Honor should have been awarded. Political considerations may have prevented additional decorations. The battle occurred partly because of massive communication breakdown between Admiral Halsey and Admiral Kincaid. Neither 3rd Fleet nor 7th Fleet commanders wanted excessive attention drawn to a battle that revealed serious command and control problems. The human cost was staggering for such a short engagement. Of Johnston's crew of 327 men, 186 died in action. Of Hull's crew of 273 men, 187 died. Of Samuel B. Roberts' crew of 224 men, 89 died in action, with an additional 25 dying from wounds or exposure afterward. Of Gambier Bay's crew of approximately 800 men, 147 died immediately, with more succumbing afterward. Taffy Threes' total casualties exceeded 1,100 dead, out of approximately 3,500 personnel engaged. The survivors who abandoned ship faced horror in the water that haunted them for the rest of their lives. Men clung to wreckage and life rafts for up to 50 hours before rescue ships arrived. The tropical sun beat down mercilessly on exposed skin. Dehydration became critical within hours. Wounds attracted sharks, drawn by blood in the water. Men watched shipmates weaken and slip beneath the surface. Some survivors developed psychological trauma that manifested decades later. Survivors' guilt and post-traumatic stress affected many veterans. The memories of watching friends die never faded. But survival rates were higher than might be expected, given the violence of the ship's sinking. This reflected excellent training in abandoned ship procedures. American ships carried adequate life-saving equipment. Sufficient life rafts and individual flotation devices were available. Crews were trained in survival procedures and practiced them regularly. When orders came to abandon ship, men executed those orders efficiently. This occurred even in the chaos of battle damage fires and flooding. The Navy's emphasis on survival training, often derided by fleet sailors as make work, saved hundreds of lives off Samar. The wreckage of the sunken ships remained lost for decades. The Philippine Trench, where the battle occurred, features some of the deepest water in any ocean. Depths exceed 2,000 feet in the area where the ships went down. Until very recently, technology did not exist to explore such depths safely. The pressure at those depths would crush conventional submarines instantly. In March 2021, explorer Victor Vescovo located the wreck of USS Johnston. She rests at a depth of 21,108 feet, using the deep submersible limiting factor. The wreck lies on an undersea slope, broken into sections but largely intact. Her bridge shows damage from the 6-inch shells that killed Commander Evans and much of his crew. Her stern section displays catastrophic damage from Yamato's 18-inch shells. The discovery confirmed Johnston as the deepest shipwreck ever surveyed by manned submersible. She held this record for 15 months until her sister ship was found. In June 2022, Vescovo's team located USS Samuel B. Roberts at 22,621 feet, making her the deepest shipwreck ever discovered. The destroyer escort lies broken into two sections on the seabed. The forward section rests upright in the mud. The aft section lies on its side about 10 meters away. The break occurred at the point where the 8-inch shell penetrated her engine room. This was the hit that ultimately sank the fighting ship. Both wreck sites are protected under the Sunken Military Craft Act. This designates them as war graves that cannot be disturbed. The remote locations and extreme depths provide natural protection from salvage operations. The ships will rest undisturbed as memorials to their crews. The story of the Battle of Samar should never be forgotten by future generations. It represents the finest traditions of naval service. It embodies the highest ideals of courage under fire. When tiny destroyers charged battleships head-on, they wrote a chapter in naval history. It stands as testament to what can be achieved through determination, sacrifice, and unwavering refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat seems absolutely certain. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz's assessment remains definitive after 8 decades. The success of Taffy Three was nothing short of special dispensation from the Lord Almighty. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison served as the official historian of United States naval operations in World War II. He provided the most enduring tribute to the men of Taffy Three. In no engagement in its entire history has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption than in those 2 morning hours between 7:30 and 9:30 off Samar.